Over the last year, some very large studies have fueled the fire in the raging debate over animal protein. Big studies linking diabetes to red meat consumption have launched major headlines and emphatic rebuttals from influencers with language like this.
If you want to show an example of how not to do scientific research, this is it.
So, shoddy science, garbage, ignore, ignore, ignore.
But the big studies keep coming. Here's one from Tufts linking animal protein to lower life expectancy and various chronic diseases in women. The big question is who to trust in this debate. Many scientists publishing these papers are epidemiologists, and to my knowledge, most of the people calling them out have no background in epidemiology. Epidemiologists study the health of populations, and a typical question they study is how does air pollution affect human health? Modern epidemiology usually involves big data and specialized knowledge, so it's hard for mere mortals and even doctors to understand. It's like radiology. Both you and your doctor seek help from a working radiologist to interpret your latest MRI. Like radiology, it takes years of study to understand epidemiology. And I'm not aware of any major influencers who seek help from epidemiologists to interpret the very papers they dismiss. And those epidemiologists have almost no presence on the internet. They're too busy actually doing epidemiology. But there is a guy who tracks them down and asks them to their faces, how do they answer their critics?
So you are a nutritional epidemiologist.
Yes.
Sounds fancy. One of many at Harvard. How many are there at Harvard?
I have no idea.
There's a lot.
There are, okay.
I've reached out to quite a few.
I
keep turning up new names.
And you might have a very fair question about me.
Yeah. Well, what do you know about epidemiology, punk?
In my earth science days, I was VP of research for a large company that had something like 34 water testing labs when I was there. I made a popular episode about the epidemiology of PFAS chemicals that, far as I can tell, hasn't received any critical pushback. I have to say, once you're steeped in environmental epidemiology, or toxicology as I sometimes call it, it is a shock to step into nutritional epidemiology. The first thing you hear is you cannot determine causality from observational data. Duh.
From an observational study, it's this cliche, association is not causality.
And they also know that you can never prove causation with observational research. You can only suggest a possible association.
And so much of what we've been told regarding what is healthy and what is unhealthy is based on observational studies, which were never meant to infer or create the judgments regarding causality.
Internet influencers say it takes an interventional trial to do that. What? In environmental epidemiology, it's your job to infer causality.
And the second edition of the book that we just came out with not too long ago is really focused on making judgments about epidemiologic evidence in a sophisticated and thoughtful way. So causal inference has really evolved quite a bit, and it really is the unifying theme for what we're trying to do with epidemiologic studies, is we're trying to design them and interpret them with that goal in mind. And the tools that are now commonly applied are directed acyclic graphs, DAGs, use of multiple bias analysis, and so on. Again, with the intention of trying to use observational data to make causal inferences.
And you can almost never do an interventional trial because you're dealing with toxic substances. Doctors, consumers, governments all demand that you infer causality and state your level of confidence. There are dozens of books on causal inference from observational data. I've read a few, and UC Berkeley alone has more than a dozen professors who list one of their specialties as causal inference. The second shock is how respected environmental epidemiologists are.
And finally, we get a certain level of respect and appreciation for us and our work. This is an old New Yorker cartoon, and it was so typically brilliant of you to have invited an epidemiologist to the cocktail party. Among the very educated, elite New Yorker types of readers, of course, there's actually cachet in being an epidemiologist.
Contrast that to how ridiculed nutritional epidemiologists are by the most popular influencers.
This is the kind of stuff that makes nutritional epidemiology the literal laughing stock of all scientific research.
The problem is that epidemiology is incapable of distinguishing between correlation and causation. You've no doubt heard this countless times.
Nutrition is such a fraught topic. I fully understand why Dr. Tobias introduces herself at parties this way.
So what do you tell people at a party that you do?
At a party, I would 100% omit the nutrition part because that only digs up people's dietary preferences
Then
and
they think
goes
you're
down.
judging them.
Yeah, or all sorts of rabbit holes that, everyone loves to talk about what they like to do or eat personally.
Here's an example of the respect that toxicologists get. Ken Berry made a video on the PFAS chemicals that DuPont has a history of dumping.
Now, you might say, well, I'm sure that, the chemical companies did long-term studies to prove that these things are safe before they put them in everything, but the answer would be no, they did not.
Anyone want to volunteer for a long-term study on the effects of industrial chemicals on humans? Doesn't it remind you of the famous scene in the movie Erin Brockovich?
By the way, we had that water brought in special for you folks. Came from Well and Hinkley.
DuPont and Chemours agreed to a fine of $671 million just a few years back, but you're not going to agree to pay $671 million in a settlement unless you're guilty.
That settlement was based on epidemiology, a 7-year study I'm very familiar with of 70,000 people. It provided enough causal evidence for a jury to convict DuPont, and Dr. Berry didn't question that epidemiology. Epidemiology works best when you have an acute exposure on a well-characterized population, as that study had. But we don't always have that for widespread exposures like air pollution. And yet, we still successfully infer causation, as you will see in this episode that we've done many times in nutrition. A third difference is consumers sometimes get mad at toxicologists when they can't find a large effect, but they sometimes get mad at nutritional epidemiologists when they do. For example, people who lived near Camp Lejeune thought their cancers were the fault of chemicals at the base. A reasonable, intuitive thing to think, but epidemiologists couldn't prove it.
Former Camp Lejeune residents went ballistic. They thought that we had exonerated these exposures so they didn't cause health harm and that we were failing, we were part of the cover-up.
But if epidemiologists cast shade on eating too much red meat, there is hell to pay.
This is an actual press release issued by the researchers themselves. People who eat just 2 servings of red meat per week may have an increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes. I think that anybody with any common sense can see that this study is foolishness on its face. This study has a preconceived notion that a plant-based diet is good for you and that red meat is bad for you.
I know several of the authors of that study well, and I interviewed the lead author. They're not vegetarians or vegans, and they tend to have amusing conversations like this.
Or eat like gourmet cheeses.
Yeah.
You have to find excitement somewhere.
Yeah, so gourmet cheeses are really exciting for you.
I mean, I think that would be like, I
One
don't
of
know.
life's great pleasures for you.
Yeah, once in a while, recreationally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like recreational marijuana.
I should mention another thing that profoundly influenced my thinking about epidemiology before we get back to more of Dr. Tobias. I left Earth Science after 17 years and joined Next Computer, the company Steve Jobs started after his breakup with Apple. We built an operating system that could support multiple processors, and you could gang the computers together to work on big problems. What I saw at Next was a computer that could handle big data. I had watched how big data revolutionized Earth Science. That operating system became OS X and iOS, and I got to watch big data revolutionize industry after industry. For example, I had friends who worked at search engines like Excite, Bing, and Yahoo, but I didn't know any of them who understood the power of big data and extracting legitimate signal from big noise. Yahoo's intuition was that human curation of the internet would produce better results than search engines as the internet got noisier. But Larry Page and Sergey Brin at Google understood big data and the power of being able to make sense of faint signal in ginormous confounded data. They hired a lot of PhD scientists, some of whom I know, and they crushed every other search engine. Big data revolutionized every industry it touched, bringing us companies like Amazon. It's doing it again with AI. I know big data is very hard to understand, and it involves a lot of deep math. I think the closest parallel we have to the situation in nutrition is Moneyball. Baseball manager Billy Beane took a chance and hired a statistician, and it revolutionized baseball.
We are card counters at the blackjack table. We're going to turn the odds on the casino.
You're discounting what scouts have done for 150 years?
Here's what he says 13 years later.
We also caught up with Mr. Moneyball, Billy Beane.
The game is really smart. In fact, I would say that baseball has become one of the most intelligent industries in the world, in my opinion. And you see it now with the use of analytics. The people running baseball teams are much different than when I started, and I think it's a compliment to the intelligence of the game.
The parallel with nutrition is the most popular voices have no background in big data, so they fall back on intuition. But what I see in modern epidemiology is big data. And big data gets better as time marches on, and it ends up crushing intuition.
So Gary Taubes wrote an article for Science magazine in 1995, where he really goes after epidemiology, saying it generates so many false positives and confuses the population. Things like, is alcohol related to breast cancer? Come on, that's a false positive. Radon, is that associated with cancer? And then another false positive. What is it with epidemiologists and have to confuse and scare all of us and have competing studies and all that? But you point out that there was another study just a couple of years ago that followed up almost 30 years to see if his false positives really were false. What did that study say?
Right. So this study followed the evidence from this big laundry list of signals where we probably can't put much trust in them because it's epidemiology. I'd never heard of the original paper, but I love the idea of this follow-up paper and this group out of Emory led by Tim Lash, who is the editor of Epidemiology, the academic journal. But what they found was about almost like 30% of this list of 40 plus associations are now
What he characterizes false positives.
Correct. Yes.
Now
we're now either settled science, so much so that there was public policy around it, right? Like when you buy a house, you get the radon testing in your basement, right? That was pseudoscience and unsettled and too small of a relative risk to be trusted in that 1995 paper. Another one, tanning beds and skin cancer. I mean, of course that's, like who would say that's not causal, right? The only people actually going to tanning beds are just, I'm only gonna do it for a couple of years because I'm 20 or whatever. But nobody would believe that it doesn't cause cancer.
When I read Gary's Science article from 1995, I was expecting it to be like his current Science is Broken tour with various podcast hosts that made my ears bleed. But my take on the article from 1995 is he had interviewed legit epidemiologists, and he knew a little about causal inference, although we've come a long way in 28 years. So there was some basis to his skepticism back then, even if he went to a lot of effort to pick examples he thought were false positives. But think back on 1995. The web was crude. Companies like Amazon and Google didn't exist. Only industries like airlines and banking could afford the IBM mainframes that allowed them to access big data. And I was working in a company developing something we thought would be revolutionary. A smartphone. We made a hit documentary about the very difficult path of what Gary probably would have called broken science back then, that culminated in modern iPhones and Android phones, which have changed the world. So I expected Gary to weigh in on this review of a paper that he wrote 28 years ago. I mean, it's scientifically fascinating, right? But I couldn't find any of that. Instead, he's doubled down on the idea that observational studies cannot determine causality.
You and I know that what these studies do is they identify associations between foods and diseases, but the associations can only generate hypotheses.
That broke my brain for a while, but I think the answer turns out to be simple. I did a stint in the book industry, and we knew from a century of sales that to create a breakaway bestseller in nutrition, it had to have 3 elements. 1, the breakthrough books say nutrition scientists got it wrong. 2, but you, the author, have figured it out because you're a doctor or a journalist who reads a lot of papers. And 3, it has to be positive about animal foods, especially meat. Consider Peter Attia's book, Outlive. He's not a longevity researcher. He hosts Gary on his podcast. He knows very little about epidemiology, dismisses almost all nutrition research, and recommends a very high meat diet. He checks all the boxes for a runaway bestseller, just like Gary does for his books. That effect is greatly amplified on social media, where influencers who fit those criteria get more than 10x the views and subscribers of people who accurately report what science really does know about nutrition. Okay, there's always an exception. How Not to Die is a runaway bestseller, and it didn't check any of those boxes. Most nutrition scientists are very open to hearing other points of view, like from Gary's colleague and fellow journalist, Nina Teicholz.
But you know what? I actually don't really mind the skepticism because it helps the field get better. If it's dishonest, which a lot of it is, I'll be honest, at least seeming to me, then that can be problematic. But when, I first heard that there's people who think saturated fat and meat are good for you as a student, I remember thinking what science are they reading? And I thought it was genuine, and maybe, I don't know, it is. But I read Big Fat Surprise to try to understand how all of the science could actually be read from a different perspective. I wanted to understand what miscommunication or room for multiple interpretations there was with nutritional epidemiology. Because if you could look at the same body of evidence and have 2 completely different reads of it, then we have to do better science, right? You need to be a little bit clearer if that's the case. But I was actually disappointed. It was not healthy skepticism with really carefully described reasons why the science was being read a different way. It was just completely not that.
You bought the book Merchants of Doubt, Naomi Oreskes' book.
I ordered it. It's on my desk.
It's a great book. Whenever I see Nina, I just think of that book. The ExxonMobil ads in climate science were entitled Unsettled Science. Her blog is entitled Unsettled Science. She's highly linked to industry. She shows photos of herself with the Dairy Council and Cattlemen's Association and all that. So what is this line I hear all day long? Correlation is not causation, and from observational studies, you cannot infer causality.
Well, correlation does not guarantee its causation, right?
But it's hard to have causation without correlation, right?
Yeah, causation implies correlation. So I love this. Causality and correlation, I could talk about that for hours. I think it's so fascinating. Not all correlations turn out to be causations. I think there are many examples where evidence had maybe suggested something. So one of the main hypotheses that the Nurses' Health Study wanted to test was total fat and breast cancer. That did not pan out in the observational epidemiology like it did in some of the ecological evidence. The correlation was seen across countries, where countries with more total fat intake had more breast cancer. But a lot of things can explain that, right? So you can't just stop with a correlation and say, oh, that's probably causation. There isn't this, well, it's from the 7-country study, so it's right. There was a lot of research that happened after that study, but it happened to be right for saturated fat and heart disease.
Dr. Tobias just mentioned ecological studies. That's where you study people around the world in search of high exposures. For example, I'm aware of a study where they affix air pollution sensors to children's packs in Mumbai and Beijing, among other places. The 7-country study was ecological because they were looking for populations around the world who had a big difference in their heart disease rates. So Finland had 9 times the rate of heart disease of Japan, and the other countries were somewhere in between. Instead of food frequency questionnaires, the scientists replicated their meals and then shipped them back to the lab for chemical analysis. And then they followed those populations for 50 years. You can see in this chart that as saturated fat in the diet rose 5-fold, heart disease deaths rose 9-fold. In combination with other types of studies, epidemiologists inferred that saturated fat is a strong causal factor for heart disease. I have never seen an internet influencer show this chart as they're promoting the health benefits of saturated fat.
If you're wondering who follows a cohort for 50 years, meet my buddy Henry Blackburn, a core member of the 7 Countries team the whole time, still playing in his band at 99.5 years. He's been incredibly helpful to me in my quest to fully understand the study. We just lost another core member, Jerry Stamler, at 102, and before that, Ansel Keys at 100. Doesn't look like avoiding saturated fat shortened their lives. I don't like anecdotes or small sample sizes, but the odds of 3 American men on a team of roughly 18 scientists with no genetic relation, born in the early 1900s and making it to 100 years of age, is around 1 in 10 billion. I should clarify that ecological studies report population averages. So this chart is showing an average of maybe 700 men in eastern Finland, an average of maybe 700 men in Japan, etc. For the studies Dr. Tobias was referencing, data is reported on individuals. They're actually complementary, each helping to understand the other. I recommend this short but solid intro to epidemiology book for people who are interested in comparing the different study types and how they complement each other. I really dislike the pyramids people create to stack rank different study types. They all have strengths and weaknesses, and how good they are depends on what you're studying. Epidemiologists generally look at every study type they can get their hands on and interpret them together. For example, some people promote interventional trials as the gold standard, and they are for drugs where you just have to take a pill and adherence is high. It's harder with food because adherence tends to fade after a year or two, depending on what the scientists ask you to stop eating and how hard it was for you to resist it.
Because those McDonald's fries are truly amazing, right? Has your mother ever made anything as good as a McDonald's fry? Not even close.
Another challenge with food interventions is it's hard to design a placebo for food. And chronic diseases take decades to develop, and interventional trials last way less than that. For example, low-carb diets tend to look very good for 6 months for weight loss and diabetes, okay for a year or two, maybe neutral for 3 to 5 years, and bad after that, and interventional trials can't capture that. By the way, we tend to use the word epidemiology for long-term observational trials, but short-term interventional trials are also epidemiology.
Tell us about that clinical trial you're doing.
Yeah, so epidemiologists do clinical trials as well. It's not all observational.
All the hierarchy of evidence pyramids I've seen place meta-analyses at the top. But here's the thing. Industries have figured out how to game them. Epidemiologists point out that all you need is a computer and internet connection for a meta-analysis. For example, Beef Checkoff paid 3 consultants to write a paper about red meat not being a cause of diabetes. They chose 21 randomized trials averaging less than 10 weeks duration for their meta-analysis. Well, yeah, red meat doesn't cause diabetes in a few weeks. It takes decades, as longer-term studies are showing. But it didn't stop influencers from promoting Beef Checkoff's gamed meta-analysis.
Eating red meat does not cause type 2 diabetes, and now results from a large meta-analysis back this up.
There are great meta-analyses, but they come from reputable teams not funded by industry. A very powerful type of study the pyramids don't list is the kind where you add randomization to observational studies.
Genetic epidemiology, Mendelian randomization as a tool for causal inference. So your genetics are randomly assigned. You have a random half from, each of your paternal and maternal genetic.
Yeah.
That is unrelated to your socioeconomic status, to your health status, to your preferences of food. It's just who you are genetically assigned from the very beginning.
Yeah.
So if you randomly got one of your parents' LDL cholesterol elevation genes and your sibling randomly didn't, then that's like an investigator saying, you're going to have high LDL your whole life, you're going to have moderately lower LDL your whole life.
It seems to me one of the revolutionary things about it is it's from birth.
Yeah.
Whereas when you do these studies on statins, they're not prescribed until somebody shows heart disease. So like you're 40 years old or something before you get a statin prescription. So it doesn't speak to the first 40 years of your life, whereas Mendelian randomization does. And I think that's why it's so dramatic. When people doubt LDL as a causal factor of heart disease, which is all over the internet saying it's bunk, it doesn't, I don't know how you can look at Mendelian randomization and say it doesn't.
That's this variability that gets captured in your data, and what epidemiology is trying to understand and to look for. Like, why do some individuals have higher LDL versus lower? The fact that there are a set of genetic drivers of that was very convenient for this tool to then look at from a more causal perspective the role of LDL in heart disease. Because now we don't have confounding from smoking and lifestyle and statin use. Not to say those can't impact the analysis in one way or the other, they certainly can. But yeah, I agree. It's incredibly hard to refute that data.
I know, it's
with
crazy.
all of the other accumulation of data as well.
So a very common thing you hear on the internet is you need a big effect size for epidemiology to work. Your risk needs to at least double for epidemiology to mean something, not just rise by 20 or 30%. Well, that may have been true before the rise of truly big data in epidemiology, but it isn't true anymore. Let's look at the story of trans fats.
You'll notice it says all vegetable. Right. Couple of scoops of this, I get all the vegetables I need. It serves up just like ice cream.
What's the story on trans fats? How did we figure out that they weren't healthy?
Yeah, trans fats, I think, is one of these really just cool, neat, tied up with a bow examples of epidemiology and policy ending up doing the right thing for public health in the end. One of the big questions that the Nurses' Health Study was able to answer was trans fat with long-term heart disease. And it was certainly not designed to answer that question. But this is sort of one of the big advantages of existing cohorts. You can go back, and as new hypotheses emerge, if you can in some way have measured that exposure, which they were able to do because they had all this diet data, now you could look at a new exposure with existing data and already 10 and then 20, 30 years of follow-up. And so the signal between consumers of high trans fat versus low trans fat, and we're only talking the difference between a couple of grams per day. It's like 5 grams versus, 2 or 3 grams.
It's amazing.
Yeah, the risk of heart disease was so much higher. That was replicated in a number of other cohorts. The feeding studies sort of looking at cholesterol levels and what happens when individuals are given and then removed and given trans fat, it just goes up drastically with that. So the mechanism seemed to be there, the biological plausibility. And this doesn't happen very often with diet and nutrition, but it was an industrially manufactured exposure that did not have to be there. So it could just be removed. Trans fats, which were banned and finally out of the food supply in the US by 2018, had already been banned in several countries in Europe and around the world for at least a decade by that point.
What about the argument that small effect sizes, like 1.2, 1.3, are irrelevant? And epidemiology cannot mean anything unless you have an effect size at least of double.
Statistically, there are more likely to be more false positives at low relative risks. But that's not the only piece of evidence that we use, right? We triangulate data from so many other sources. And when a moderate effect size or a small effect size corroborates with the experimental data, the animal models, the biological plausibility, dose response from feeding studies, that 30% is looking pretty good. And actually the relative risk for trans fat, comparing 5 versus 2.5 grams per day, is like 1.3. It was small, but it could not be explained by anything else.
So you saw how careful Dr. Tobias is when inferring causality and how she considers all the factors. And epidemiologists have a lot of tools for inferring causality, but consumers prefer to believe in a single, simple cause. Here's an example. The very people who are warning that correlation is not causation are unwittingly inferring cause to the observations of their blood glucose readings. Since carbs raise blood sugar, they're inferring that carbs are the cause of type 2 diabetes. But blood pressure rises when you exercise, so does that make exercise the cause of high blood pressure? We believed that a half-century ago, and that's why I had to mow the lawn for my grandfather and father so they could avoid blood pressure spikes. But a core tenet of epidemiology is that chronic disease is multifactorial. Epidemiologists at the Framingham Heart Study have figured out that lack of exercise, weight, sodium intake, more than 500 genes, stress, anger, atherosclerosis, and air pollution all play a role in high blood pressure. The story is the same for diabetes. Epidemiologists know to combine a lot more types of data than just blood glucose. For example, among the many risk factors are weight, body composition, where we store our fat, lack of exercise, age, genetics, ethnicity, sugary drinks, and surprisingly, many research groups are reporting that red meat consumption is probably causal. I made episodes about the causes of diabetes. The good news is glucose monitors are very good indicators of whether you have diabetes, but very weak indicators of the cause. Epidemiologists have very sophisticated tools to infer causality, like DAG charts. If you want a masterclass on how to use them, I recommend this video from Peter Tennant, who is very solid.
For me as a scientist, it's been genuinely the most sort of thrilling moment of my career in the last 2 years to start to learn about these methods and the implications that they have.
Peter has a 1-week boot camp on causal inference. Harvard has one for 2 weeks every summer, and there are many more. For every influencer on the internet who's convinced their diet is the one, there is another who believes the exact opposite. It's impossible for a consumer to go on social media and not be baffled. But we made a spreadsheet of 114 country dietary guidelines, each created by their own scientists. I'll link it in the description. They are remarkably consistent. More plants, less meat, less processed food. We've interviewed scientists involved in dietary guidelines from Norway, Japan, Canada, and the US for a future episode. The difference is, as far as I can tell, all country dietary committees got epidemiologists involved who understand big data and causal inference. There are precious few influencers who understand epidemiology, and they're aligned with country guidelines. The really beautiful thing is once you learn a few simple principles of epidemiology, you can see through instantly some pretty crazy claims.
Could the seed oils be the primary cause of the diseases of civilization? They are poisons, plain and simple.
Even though that talk went viral and swept across the internet, you now know what epidemiologists have known for 150 years, that chronic disease is multifactorial. Not only that, but he's inferring cause from a strong correlation that seed oils are in ultra-processed foods, and ultra-processed foods are one of the causes of the diseases of civilization. But that correlation goes the other way when seed oils are added to veggie stir-fries, for example. The moral of the story is if you have problems with your eyes, seek an ophthalmologist, which Chris is. But if you want to infer causality, seek an epidemiologist. If you're wondering why the constant change in scenery, it's because I'm with my family, and I'm catching spare moments whenever I get a chance. The second instant tell is when an influencer says you cannot infer cause from observational data. Most of them are doing exactly that, but they're inferring cause from anecdotes or data that was never intended to infer cause.
The world is getting heavier, the United States leads the way, and here's where the US dietary guidelines were introduced, 1980.
The third tell is when they claim food frequency questionnaires are trash.
The reliance on food frequency questionnaires, something I've even filled out myself just to prove how ridiculously useless they are. Like, ask me what I ate 2 days ago. Not a chance I'm going to be able to give you anything within an order of magnitude of reality.
Peter delivers misinformation with such confidence. I imagine 99 of 100 people believe it. Probably the ones who don't have a little bit of knowledge about epidemiology. All you have to do is pull up the questionnaires which are public on the net, and you'll see they don't ask you to remember what you ate 2 days ago. The food frequency questionnaires, can you talk about how they're designed? I understand from reading Walter Willett's textbook, which you teach from, right?
Yes.
That it's like a 2-year process. All kinds of testing and iteration. And
Yeah, I mean, even more than 2 years. I think it's always a work in progress. A food frequency questionnaire is not trying to ascertain what the person had yesterday, right? I think that's such a big misconception.
no one can remember that. But what everyone can remember is what their diet has been on average over the last year. Ask anyone their habitual diet and they'll instantly respond, oh, I have bacon and eggs several times a week, and I always have coffee with some cream and sugar in the morning. People remember what they do habitually, including Peter, who reports that he eats 5 to 10 sticks of deer jerky loaded with salt, sometimes on the daily. These food questionnaires have been continually refined for 40 years and compared against weighted food records and 24-hour recalls. People can remember what they ate for 24 hours. There is another very critical factor that governs how accurate these questionnaires are.
Such a big misconception is nutritional epidemiology, or epidemiology in general to some people, has no idea how to measure exposures or behaviors, and nobody remembers, and if they do, they're gonna maliciously tell you the wrong answer. And that was actually one of the motivations for enrolling this specific population of nurses. They would be able to sort of recall and understand all these questions with a medical lens, right? So they knew what you meant when you asked elevated blood pressure or dyslipidemia or osteoporosis. It was not meant for a lay audience, the whole questionnaire.
I see.
This population in the cohort had an educational background in the sciences and could quantify and estimate.
It's my personal opinion that Drs. Attia and Kenobi are doing a lot of harm by disavowing epidemiology without knowing much about it, and instead relying on intuition and anecdotes to infer cause. I made an episode about Dr. Attia's book. Here I am in a self-driving robo-taxi. No driver, look at that wheel go. Made possible by big data. They're everywhere. And I can't believe I'm watching a recent video from Nina Teicholz where she's taking us back to the US food pyramid from 32 years ago in her never-ending quest to discredit science.
It correlates with a huge increase in obesity. So obesity, before the guidelines were started in 1980, obesity was at 12-13%, and now it is, it's officially at almost 43%, but that's a number from 2016.
I suppose it's possible that this humble home economics teacher from Sweden, who invented the food pyramid 18 years before ours, is the person to blame. Sweden's pyramid looked just like ours with grains at the base. But then why is Sweden's obesity rate 16%, 128th in the world? Is she also to blame for Japan's obesity rate? They too came up with a visual guide that places grains as the largest food group, but their obesity rate is just 4%. You don't want to see a causal diagram for obesity. So many causal arrows. The largest share in blue have to do with the rise of fast and junk food. Sweden has a lot less of that. And social influences in red. Japan has a whole lot less of that. I made an episode about Japan's school lunch and food education program, which is the envy of the world. But the plot thickens and darkens.
Why is nutrition advice so wrong? Why is it so out of sync with the science? And I think the only way to really understand this is not innocent incompetence, but I think there are a number of forces working behind the scenes that influence nutrition science.
The internet loves a good conspiracy about dark forces. I suppose it's possible that all of the 114 countries with similar food guides have dark forces to corrupt their scientists. But I think there's a simpler explanation. The scientists on the committees understand how to infer cause. Without that ability, superstition and conspiracies do run wild. I would love to leave it there, but I deserve a slap if I leave the impression that nutrition misinformation is single cause. Nina brings up a crucial point.
I really want to focus on trying to draw back the curtain so that people can see the forces and the conflicts that are behind our trusted scientists and institutions.
I am all in on understanding the role of corporate influence, and that's why I've interviewed Marianne Nessel twice, the author of the acclaimed book Food Politics. And it's why I often mention how important the books about merchants of doubt are. But here's the thing, with just a glance at social media or book sales, you can see consumers are not getting nutrition advice from epidemiologists. They're getting it from influencers. And while epidemiologists are supposed to disclose conflicts of interest, influencers don't have to, but we have some windows into the finances of influencers.
We have a lawsuit, which means that things that big companies and famous people wanted to keep hidden are dropping into the public record. And this one is a doozy. In July 2023, the longevity doctor Peter Attia sued the fitness tracking company Oura Ring, claiming that it owes him $1.3 million in unallocated stock options. But this is not a run-of-the-mill lawsuit to collect on an overdue bill. It is a blueprint for the relationships between medical companies and medical influencers, and offers us a rare peek into the money that moves around behind the scenes that subtly and sometimes overtly affects the way that all of these people communicate human health information. It details how much money Attia was supposed to be paid, how and when he took direction from Oura to land stories in the mainstream media, and most importantly, at least to me, his role in placing the fitness tracker into scientific studies in order to market the product.
That's Scott Carney, and I recommend his channel if you're curious about how your favorite influencers bring in millions.
In 2021, just a few years ago, Huberman had what seemed like a definitive stance on blue light and circadian rhythms.
It doesn't matter if you block the blues.
Yeah.
If you're looking at bright light at night, you're going to disrupt your circadian cycle.
He even sort of made fun of companies that sold gimmicky products to block blue light.
The concept of blue light being bad led to a lot of product development.
But last month, he changed his tune.
Roca and I designed these glasses, which, as you can see, have red lenses that filter out the specific short wavelengths of light that activate the cells that wake you up.
Did a lucrative sponsorship opportunity change his opinion on settled science?
Influencers know that if you get big views and subscribers, you can get big sponsorships, and your sponsors will promote you as you promote them. And they also know you don't get big views with the message, "Eat your veggies, kids." That's the message of epidemiologists who don't get the views or make the millions. Peter dropped out of his medical residency, didn't get board certified, and joined the famous business consulting company McKinsey. He knows how to land appearances on Oprah, Rogan, Huberman, etc. And he knows the talking points that get the views. When is the last time you heard of an epidemiologist appearing on Oprah, Rogan, or Huberman and bringing in millions in sponsorships? You may be asking, what about you, Chris? Are you sponsored by Big Epidemiology? This is actually my expensive retirement hobby.
Yes, expensive. Expensive is definitely the right term.
I don't accept donations, gifts, sponsorships, freebies, and I turn off all the ads that YouTube will allow me to turn off. Remind me of why I do this again. If you're going to promote broccoli, you ain't in it for the fame and the fortune. Just ask an epidemiologist.
Almost there. Don't forget your phone, keys, or holiday cheer.